Welcome to the Ash Cloud. I'm Ash Sweeting. Today we are joined by Richard Heath, the founding CEO of the Zero Net Emissions from Agriculture Cooperative Research Centre that aims to catalyse the Australian agricultural industries, community and government to achieve zero net emissions from agriculture by 2040.
73 partners who committed $87 million in cash. And then the government committed to match that dollar for dollar. And then with in-kind contributions as well, it took it to a $300 million program over 10 years, which is the biggest CRC that's ever been funded.
Many companies are committed to reduce their footprint, but lack viable and implementable solutions to achieve these targets.
So many of the supply chain companies and partners that are making commitments about achieving net zero at various points and how they're going to do that. And a lot of the time they're making commitments in largely the absence of pathways for delivery and technology solutions that can help them get there. So there's a very high level of interest in investing in solutions to make sure that they can meet their commitments.
Methane is a major focus.
Most of the emissions come from cattle and sheep, red meat, basically ruminants as methane. So obviously that's where most of the investment will be.
We need to be watching the grass grow.
To be honest, I see some really early wins with some of the new pasture species that are very close to commercialisation that have methane reducing potential.
There's a lot that we are yet to know.
We'll be working very much on the genetics of animals, estimated breeding values, improving those, getting good EBVs for methane efficiency. We'll also be working on measurement and validation systems. And that is one of the big things that's missing in this whole environment is accurately quantifying what is actually going on.
There are no simple solutions.
We need to be thinking about stacking technologies into an overall farm system. There will not be a silver bullet. There will not be one widget. There will not be a single policy that will go towards how we solve emissions from agriculture. It's going to be the story that developing best practice in agriculture has always been, which is incremental, lots of things stacked together to build better systems.
There are no substitutes for excellent management and no excuses for poor management.
Productivity gain, just general productivity gain, right? You know, getting weaning weights 1 week earlier, 2 weeks earlier, a month earlier is actually a methane efficiency story as well. Almost all better farming practice in animals and productivity gains have a positive emission story, because if you are raising healthy animals that are converting feed really well and reaching a weaning or a sale weight a month earlier than they would be otherwise, that's a month of avoided emissions.
Government has a critical role.
The Australian government is doing really actually quite well in this space at the moment. They are enabling industry to move on this, and rather than imposing targets, imposing goals, imposing taxes, they really are about, we understand that industry actually has an interest, more than an interest, has a requirement to reduce emissions. We will help industry, the government, this is the government saying, that we will help industry achieve this through facilitating R&D, setting up, making sure that the trade arrangements are appropriate, all those sorts of things.
Solutions must be local.
Sustainability requirements associated with trade need to be place-based. They cannot be global. They cannot be universal, because sustainability solutions that might work in Europe or North America or South America or Australia or Asia will not work in other countries and other areas. The values are the same that we're all trying to deliver against, and that's what we should focus on.
Farmers are needed.
In terms of farmers becoming involved, we are going to have a network of 25 producer demonstration sites all over the country, which we really hope will be the bit of the CRC that farmers can go and see, touch and feel. to see technologies being demonstrated at scale commercially, stacked together.
Richard, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks, Ash. Happy to be here.
The zero net emissions for agriculture CRC is very, very new. Could you please tell me about what you're hoping to achieve and what it's for, who your partners are?
Sure. So we're trying to achieve exactly what it says on the tin. We are the zero net emissions from agriculture CRC, and we are trying to provide, we will, I'm going to be confident about this, we will provide farmers with the tools, technologies and systems to be able to achieve zero net emissions from their businesses and from agricultural supply chains. The CRC program is a program funded by the Commonwealth Government of Australia. It's been around for a few decades now. The way it operates is that the government has a bid round generally every year. Sometimes it might be a bit less frequent than that, where they provide the opportunity for a research lead, generally, not always, a university or a State Department of Agriculture or state government. They're not all agriculture. The CRCs are sort of right across the economy, to pull a whole lot of partners together, because it is, again, as what it says on the tin, a cooperative research centre. It is dependent on lots of people coming together into an alliance, into a cooperative group, and then those people need to be able to commit cash and in-kind to research a particular focus idea. Now, if the bid's successful, then the government will match those cash contributions, generally dollar for dollar. For this CRC, and I'll get to why in a minute, but for this CRC, there were 87 partners in the end who committed cash and in-kind to the bid process. 73 partners. I'm still getting my head around the numbers. This is very fresh. 73 partners who committed $87 million in cash. Now, that's a hugely significant amount, because that's their cash that they're putting into the bid. And then the government committed to match that dollar for dollar. And then with in-kind contributions as well, it took it to a $300 million program over 10 years, which is the biggest CRC that's ever been funded out of the program. And I think really it's not surprising that it's had such a high level of interest and has ended up being the biggest CRC when you look at the urgency for solutions to be delivered around achieving net zero in agricultural supply chains. Everyone is demanding that to happen through various mechanisms. You've got so many of the supply chain companies and partners that are making commitments about achieving net zero at various points and how they're going to do that. And a lot of the time they're making commitments in largely the absence of pathways for delivery and technology solutions that can help them get there. So there's a very high level of interest in investing in solutions to make sure that they can meet their commitments. So our partners, as well as the research providers, universities and state governments of agriculture, we've got 11 universities involved. We've got every state and territory in Australia that are partners as well. They're also global agribusiness and supply chain companies and retailers that are the organisations that are making these commitments, but then needing to back it up with investment into delivering solutions that will help them meet their commitments as well. So a really big initiative, a very big partnership, lots of excitement as it gets underway, great spirit of collaboration and a sense of urgency to actually start getting stuff delivered.
Wonderful. So you voluntarily signed up to be the person with 70 or 80 people knocking on your door saying, we need to get over to the other side of the river. We have no idea how we're going to get there. And you're sitting there saying, I'm going to solve your problems. So yeah,
it's crazy.
Your perception, why did you jump into that? That's
okay. So look,
it's also
I think
not straightforward.
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly exciting opportunity, and I really can't wait to get my teeth into it. So a bit of background I get about myself possibly might help in understanding that. I've been a farmer most of my life. I farmed for 20 years on the Liverpool Plains of New South Wales. And I was very fortunate to be in a family farming business that appreciated research and development, that participated in trials, that did a lot of our own trials. I did a Nuffield scholarship myself, looking at nitrogen use efficiency. It's something I've just always had a very strong interest in, is research and development, innovation and technology to meet the sustainability challenges and the climate crisis that we're facing. And so, since I finished farming, I've been involved in some policy roles as well that have sort of been looking at the appropriate policy to enable the development of all these technologies and meet these challenges. Now to have this opportunity to get more back into the applied side of things and invest in the development of these solutions, it's something that I'm just tremendously excited about.
Wonderful. So in terms of net zero or zero net emissions and what the priorities are, do you want us to talk us through those areas?
So most of the emissions come from cattle and sheep, red meat, basically ruminants, as methane. So obviously that's where most of the investment will be. But this is a zero net emissions from agriculture program. We will be looking at all of agriculture. We will have a large and distributed portfolio that will be working across all sectors and all geographies in Australia. Where are the priorities? The priorities will be across the board. So it might help just to outline really quickly what our main research pillars are and programs and how the CRC is going to be structured. So there's 4 programs. They are basically plants as pillar 1, animals as pillar 2, pillar 3 is whole farm systems, and pillar 4 is the other opportunities that are coming out of the transition to net zero in the entire economy that can be pulled into farm businesses to help as well and provide opportunity. So going through them in a bit more detail, the first one being plants, that will be cropping systems, horticulture, looking at things like coated fertilizers, fertilizer efficiencies, bringing more legumes into systems, looking at potentially agroforestry and how that can be incorporated into cropping systems. So very broadly how the cropping systems and plants can be focused on to reduce emissions. But also in that plants pillar, there'll be a very significant part of that is still working towards the methane issue and animals through improved pastures and plants as pastures, basically. And that's one of the things as I've sort of got into this where, to be honest, I see some really early wins with some of the new pasture species that are very close to commercialisation that have methane reducing potential. In terms of the adoption issues around how we modify grazing systems to reduce emissions, changing the pastures, the plants that animals eat, that's one of the easier things to do. So, if people are already planting pastures in intensive grazing systems, obviously this might imply so much for rangeland work, but if you're already planting pastures in intensive systems, it's just putting a different bag of pasture seed in the mix, and you get that established and you just start reducing methane emissions. So that's quite exciting for me with my farmer hat on in terms of the cost of transition and adoption and technology and the ease of doing that. Pillar 2 is working on the animals themselves much more directly. So that is, what a lot of people would typically associate with the effort for emissions reduction. It's rumen manipulation, it's active compounds and how they can help. We won't work directly on the active compounds themselves, things like Asparagopsis, because there's just a lot of work being done in that space already, a lot of research, a lot of programs that are looking at exploring the actives. What we feel we can do, and one of the questions that gets asked a lot, particularly in the extensive grazing systems, is about delivery of those compounds. So how do we, we might find something that has a fantastic effect on reducing methane emissions. But if it's something that requires a feed additive or much more intensive sort of work with animals to actually get it into the animal, it just doesn't work in extensive systems and rangelands. So what else can we do in terms of getting those active compounds delivered into animals effectively in extensive systems? So we'll have quite a program around that. We'll be working very much on the genetics of animals, estimated breeding values, improving those, getting good EBVs for methane efficiency. We'll also be working on measurement and validation systems, and that is one of the big things that's missing in this whole environment, is accurately quantifying what is actually going on. We still rely a lot on modelling, and the ability to more directly measure methane outputs is going to have a huge impact on not just, we need that to actually have credible systems around rewards for farmers that achieve methane reductions, but it's also really important to know that we're getting the results we think we are from technological change as well. Things like developing EBVs, any other estimated breeding value, you can generally understand whether you're getting the what you think you hope to be getting out of that, those improved genetics, by measurements on farm over weigh scales or something else, condition scores, whatever. We need to be able to do that with methane in the same way, so that when you're introducing new genetics that you are actually getting a positive effect on methane emissions as well. Pillar 3, so whole farm systems, really important, and a fundamental principle in the way this CRC is going to operate is that we need to be thinking about stacking technologies into an overall farm system. There will not be a silver bullet. There will not be one widget. There will not be a single policy that will go towards how we solve emissions from agriculture. It's going to be the story that developing best practice in agriculture has always been, which is incremental, lots of things stacked together to build better systems. So again, with the measurement and validation side of that, that's quite hard to do once you're not measuring one thing. If you're measuring lots of things, and particularly in the context, if the recognition and reward systems around that in terms of potential for carbon credits or insetting or something other than the productivity and profitability gain that you're getting from adopting those technologies, they need to have good measurement and validation systems. And again, we don't really do that well for whole farm systems at the moment. So that'll be a really important and big component of the CRC as well. And then finally, there is so much going on in the whole of economy transition to net zero around renewable energy, hydrogen, solar, circular economy concepts. What are we doing with waste? And so what are those opportunities that can be readily pulled into and taken advantage of by farm businesses for reward, but also just to improve their net zero position as well, and to enhance their productivity and profitability. So a really broad scope of stuff, quite ambitious, but we've got the resources to do it, and hopefully we will make a real difference there.
That is a very exciting group of focus areas. I am particularly excited by the interaction, the whole farm system side of things, because when animals are grazing, they're also fertilizing.
Yeah.
They're also changing the way water moves through soil, and that impacts plant nutrient composition and so many things, and the flow of gases both backwards and forwards, and the need for external impacts. And it's one of those fascinating things, because what might be the right thing to do last week will not necessarily be the optimal thing to do next week, because you're in an open air system where everything's constantly changing. So with all of that, and I guess from the there will need to be monitoring, you said, data systems. How does that fit into the whole process? Do they sit within the pillars, or do they sit kind of across the whole program? Or is that yet to be determined? That's work in progress.
Yeah, look, work in progress. I mean, data and data infrastructure and systems and protocols around, how data is transferred to enable in the better accounting across multiple farm systems. That's a big challenge that we've been addressing in agriculture for a while now, going right back to the early days of ag tech and data integration and technology integration. It continues to be a challenge. It's getting better, I think. It continues to get better, and standards around protocols for data transfer and things like that are helping with all of that. But there's no question, it is still a barrier for effective accounting in developing those really good fluid data systems.
And of the people that are partners, and they're all Australian based, or is it open to international people to participate, or international organizations and companies to join in as well?
We have some global agribusinesses involved. We have some New Zealand businesses involved. There are limitations in terms of funding research occurring in another country, but absolutely we're open to working with international organisations that are researching here, that are operating in Australia, as we should be. And we'll also be very much looking outwardly to the rest of the world in terms of what's happening in the research space, how we can leverage that, how we can work collaboratively with other organisations internationally that are working in the same space as well.
That great to hear about the collaboration. And in terms of the projects, the research, the ideas, how or the technologies that are coming through, how does how does that work? And secondly, what's some of the exciting stuff that has been coming across your desk up to date?
Sure. So look, we'll have, as any reasonably large research investment program has, a portfolio that spreads risk, that spreads technology stages, where it's at in the innovation cycle in terms of whether it's more at the R end, whether it's more at the commercialization end. We'll have a full portfolio of work. But one of the, well, not one, the consistent thing that will be present across every project that we invest in, this is an industry-led CRC. We have lots of industry partners, supply chain partners that are involved. As a compulsory requirement for every research project for it to be invested in, it will have to have an industry partner involved in the project, whose role will be to advise, participating in, provide a pathway for impact and commercialisation. And it's really important that we do that to get impact. We'll also have an industry advisory committee that's made up of representatives of our industry members that advise the board again on barriers to adoption, impact pathways, commercialisation considerations, so that we ensure that everything we're doing has the next user identified. And more than the next user being identified, the next user participating and understanding what is coming through, so that outputs from a research project are ready to be adopted by whoever that next user is. And the next user, if it's close to market, the next user may be the farmer. If it's at the other end of the innovation cycle, the next user, if we're talking about a genetics project or something like that, the next user might be a seed development company but we're just going to really make sure and put a lot of effort into making sure that pathway to impact is understood. Everyone knows where they sit in the innovation cycle and what the next step of that's going to be.
You were recently up at Beef Week in Rockhampton, and during that time, you've spoken about all the support you've had from governments, from the universities, from large global agribusiness and Australian agribusiness. I'm guessing at Beef Week you spoke to many farmers, many producers. What's their take? What's the vibe in that space?
So look, it's not uncommon, I think, to a discussion that's happening globally at the moment around methane and how methane should be counted, and then what the consequences of those accounting methodologies are in terms of expectations of improvements against goals and targets that are being set. That's a universal discussion that's being had at the moment. Now, it's a discussion that absolutely has to happen. It's important in terms of commitments that are being made globally, and understanding about how achievable those commitments are, or should be. From a pure research and development point of view, and leaving the policy question of that to the side a little bit, I see a win-win situation, regardless of the policy environment, that a focus on reducing methane from cattle and sheep and making them more methane efficient delivers. And that is really two things. We all accept now that we are in a climate crisis, that we need to do something about the climate. Otherwise, the future of agriculture is at risk, enhanced risk, and it's going to make it much more difficult. There is also no question that removing methane from the atmosphere will have a cooling effect. So it's important that we reduce methane, that we remove methane from the atmosphere to help with mitigating that climate crisis. So then you look at, well, who should be doing that? Where are the responsibilities? How can we do that? How can anyone that is in the economy anywhere that has methane emissions, what can they do about it? What responsibility do they have to do about it? And that's where I sort of leave, perhaps, to avoid getting into some of those discussions that immediately can get quite defensive when you start talking about a responsibility to do something, to what's the advantage of doing something. And I think in agriculture, with some of the technologies that are getting very close to market now, and they're going to have a genuine productivity and profitability impact in making animals more methane efficient while reducing methane emissions. So it is a win-win situation. If there is carbon in the feed, the animals, to really sort of bring it down to the most basic equation, if there's carbon in the feed that animals are eating, whether it's pasture or rations or whatever, and that carbon is going into the atmosphere as methane rather than going into the animal as production, then that's waste. That's a productivity lost. So if we can change that equation and we can make sure that more of that carbon is getting converted into productivity at a cost that is profitable, then why wouldn't we be wanting to do that? Why wouldn't we be wanting to explore that and at the same time get the methane reduction, which which addresses that long-term issue around the climate crisis?
Lots to go on from there. In terms of, we only understand the number varies somewhere 10, 15, 20% or no of what's going on in the rumen in terms of that rumen microbiome population. So there's a lot of foundational research that's needed to be done there. There's a whole lot of work led by Rod Mackey at the University of Illinois looking at the biokinetics of hydrogen, largely funded or partially funded by the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research. There's other projects. That's a combination of Australian research, New Zealand research, European research, and here in the US and Canada. There are other people looking at that as well. UC Davis is working with UC Berkeley on using CRISPR to gene editing to try and enhance the microbiome for exactly the same purpose, but it's all very foundational. So where does that fit into starting from scratch and doing the research in Australia when we can collaborate more broadly, and also that balance between, investing in that foundational research, which will have a longer time to gain a return, but have a bigger impact compared with some of the things that might be more immediate?
So I think sometimes what gets lost in this discussion all that foundational stuff is incredibly important, right? And that leads to transformational change down the track when we start being able to manipulate rumens significantly, change the way they behave, introduce new genetics. But productivity gain, just general productivity gain, right? You know, getting weaning weights 1 week earlier, 2 weeks earlier, a month earlier is actually a methane efficiency story as well. Almost all better farming practice in animals and productivity gains have a positive emission story, because if you are raising healthy animals that are converting feed really well and reaching a weaning or a sale weight a month earlier than they would be otherwise, that's a month of avoided emissions. So, I think that in terms of close to market stuff and getting stuff out there that is genuinely having an impact on the emission story in animals, I think we actually need to recognise that it's been happening for a long time. It can continue to happen more just through actually a focus on standard best practice management of animals and understanding what that best practice management and improvements in best practice management have on the emissions equation as well. So I think there's a lot of stuff that's actually happening every day and is close to market. And then you throw in the transformational foundational science stuff as well. And that's why I am genuinely excited about where I think we can go. I think we can have really significant improvements over time.
And that gives you a pathway to make short-term gains by those management practices, starting to monitor methane and managing around that as well as, and that gives time for the longer term interventions, such as the time it will take to include into breeding programs, as well as some of the rumen microbiome work to get to the stage of commercialization.
Exactly. Yes.
There's been, I guess, if you look across the world, there's a lot of people talking about net zero and emissions from livestock, and there's different approaches in different jurisdictions. New Zealand was looking at putting caps on emissions, and they backtracked. Netherlands and Denmark have put in they're planning quite big restrictions, and that's led to political unrest. California's mandated a 40% reduction by 2030. If you head a bit further east of here and across the other side of the Rockies, there's a lot less stringent regulations. Where Australia's had a chance to, and I know you're not in policy now, but Australia's had a chance to sit and look at what other parts of the world are doing. Many of them our trading partners. And how do you see the balance between those options in terms of, navigating for the best outcome and, maintaining geopolitical stability or political stability within the country and ensuring that no one feels like they're being ostracized or isolated by the government and the communities?
So there's 3 things that I think the Australian government is doing really actually quite well in this space at the moment. The first is that they are enabling industry to move on this, and rather than imposing targets, imposing goals, imposing taxes, they really are about, we understand that industry actually has an interest, more than an interest, has a requirement to reduce emissions. We will help industry, the government, this is the government saying, that we will help industry achieve this through facilitating R&D, setting up, making sure that the trade arrangements are appropriate, all those sorts of things. So as long as they continue to do that, I think that's creating a really good environment. The other thing that they're in that sort of saying, we recognise industry has a requirement to do this, it is very much around recognising that trade environment for emissions reduction. Australia is a totally export-dependent agricultural economy, and increasingly the requirements to demonstrate sustainability credentials with exports are becoming a condition of trade. What the second thing that the government, I think, is doing quite well in Australia, and I would like to see a much better approach to this globally, is recognising that for that to deliver true sustainability outcomes, that sustainability requirements associated with trade need to be place-based. They cannot be global. They cannot be universal, because sustainability solutions that might work in Europe or North America or South America or Australia or Asia will not work in other countries and other areas. The values are the same that we're all trying to deliver against, and that's what we should focus on. We should all be trying to deliver, improve, have trade conditions that enhance the prospects of improving biodiversity, reducing emissions, all those sorts of sustainability attributes. But to think that by doing that, we impose strict conditions around methodologies, around practices, around, a set of laws that would apply everywhere, is going to deliver perverse sustainability outcomes. So, again, I think that the Australian government's been quite good in international forums in bringing that up as an issue that needs to be resolved, and have trade based on values rather than prescribed practices.
In terms of if you want to get involved with the CRC, be that as a producer, as a agribusiness, as a technology company or a startup, what's the process?
So the CRC is a member-based company. We will have a process where organisations can join as members. Right now, we're just concentrating. We're literally a startup, getting everything established, getting agreements signed with existing members, a Commonwealth agreement that is going to consume us for some time, being such a large organisation. But once the CRC is up and running and operating, then we will have a process where organisations can express an interest in becoming a member and can go through a process to do that. In terms of farmers becoming involved, we are going to have a network of 25 producer demonstration sites all over the country, which we really hope will be the bit of the CRC that farmers can go and see, touch and feel, to see technologies being demonstrated at scale commercially, stacked together, and act as a real extension mechanism, adoption mechanism. That's not all we'll be doing. We'll be having lots of extension channels and opportunities for farmers to see what's happening with the possibilities around emissions reduction technology.
I know it's very early days, so there's not a lot come in yet, but are there any projects, anything that's come through that you're very excited about that you can share with us at the moment?
Sure. So look, some of I mentioned before, just the breeding efforts into pastures that are looking at things like the way that, or an understanding that the way that compounds are expressed in the flowers of a pasture plant compared to the leaves differ, and in fact the way that those compounds are expressed in the flowers are lower methane reducing, or they have a bigger methane reducing potential. So if there's a way of engineering that into the leaves as well as the flowers, then you start reducing methane. There's so many really interesting and intriguing plant breeding efforts that we can look at just by starting to screen a bit more and understand the way that plants get metabolized in the rumen of animals, and understanding that every plant is different, every part of a plant is different in that context. And so once we have that understanding, how can we focus on either the parts of the plants or the different plants that have a methane reducing impact? So, for instance, thinking about endemic pastures rather than improved or planted pastures, and the number of species that are in an endemic pasture mix, say across northern Australian rangeland, screening all of those to see which ones have, a bigger methane reducing potential. And then once we understand that, is there grazing systems, agronomy, is there indigenous knowledge that we can harness and understand to boost those plants in the endemic mix compared to others, and then have a significant methane reducing potential as a result of that. So I think that there's a whole range of stuff that we can do in the plant space with a focus on methane reduction from animals, just through that. Firstly, screening to understand how, as I said, how either parts of plants or the plants themselves have different effects, and then once we have that knowledge, what can we do about it?
I love the pasture side of things, because it's a tool and a technique or a management practice that people have been using for decades or centuries, and so there's no behavioural change, no new management systems and all that sort of stuff. And what you just said is actually really interesting, because it possibly means we have to reevaluate some of the priorities in terms of plant breeding, where for the last number of decades it's been vegetative growth, delay the onset of flowering, but then maybe you want to have more diversity in terms of that onset of flowering, or maybe you need to adjust your grazing practices, so management tweaks with the different species to get that combination between the different parts of the plant. So absolutely fascinating.
Yep.
Richard, it's been wonderful talking to you. And before we go, is there anything else that you'd like to add that we haven't already discussed?
Look, not really. I mean, early days, as you've said. It's early, exciting days, though. I've been so encouraged getting into this job, just with the spirit of collaboration that's been there amongst all the partners that really want to roll their sleeves up and have a go and get things done. And so, with that sort of attitude amongst all our partners, and I'm just so excited about getting this thing underway and starting to fund projects and seeing the impacts of that on the ground, and having a significant impact.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very, very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Ash.
You've been listening to The Ash Cloud with me, Ash Sweeting, in conversation with Richard Heath, recorded in California in May 2024.